Hope all of us are doing great out there. I'd like to welcome each and every one of us to my channel of Honest Sciences and Mathematics TV channel. In today's discussion, I'm going to look at the second part of the role of chemical elements in biological systems. And this is going to complement on our first video, whereby we had looked generally at the broader functions or roles of these specific, of course, chemical elements in the biological system. And we had restricted ourselves in our first video on the concept of atoms, various kinds of atoms of elements in terms of their ionic form. Now, in a sense, today we are going to broaden our discussion and, of course, entail these other aspects of elements in terms of non-metallic elements. And we shall look at a range of elements which are going to be assisting us basically appreciate the role of these specific elements in biological systems. So we shall look at of course, function of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And of course, if time allows, we shall look at other elements, which of course might include calcium, magnesium, iron, sodium, potassium, and chlorine in that specific order. So this is going to be, of course, assessed from the elemental form, whereby we're going to look at these individual elements which have mentioned, particularly in our categories of those specific elements which I've given in particular order. Then, assessed from our last video, we have decided that one of the roles of this specific or chemical elements is structural function. And we had mentioned that we're going to have a range of elements which are going to be providing for conditions for formation of some of the bonds, which we're going to see that are going to be ensuring that the structural integrity of some of the biomolecules are going to be maintained. And in a sense, these are going to be providing for the structural functions. And we had mentioned a few of these specific elements which particularly are going to be concerned, and we give an example of calcium, zinc, and magnesium, which basically formed some of the examples of elements which we're going to be considering in trying to look at the structural integrity of some of the biological molecules in biosystems, which I've mentioned. So we shall as well look at this specific second set, which we said that some of these elements are going to play a role of being charge carriers, and these are going to be assisting, especially, of course, in transfer of information within biological systems, especially bodies of organisms. Now, in our previous discussion on the concept of course, cell physiology, we had mentioned this particular concept, and we had said that some of the elements are going to be, of course, involved in this specific function, where I talked about the concept of ion channels, which are referred to as ionophores. And we said that information inside the cell is going to be transferred in forms of impulses, which are, of course, going to be electrical impulses. And this, of course, as I said, we also encountered this specific concept in our discussion on the concept of the human nervous system. So I'm going to put a link of this specific, of course, video in one of our playlists of biology topics. And I'd kindly like to request our members to be checking those specific topics so that we can be at bar with this particular discussion. And in a sense, for the charge carriers, we mentioned that some of the elements which are going to be considered in this particular case include the elements like sodium, potassium, hydrogen, among others. So as we said, these are going to be considered in ion forms, which we can perhaps give in terms of this specific representation given as such. So as well, we said that we're going to be, but for the first case, we're going to consider, in case we're going to talk, for instance, of the human support system, we can talk of the concept of calcium. So therefore, I prefer to maintain the first one as such, so that we can cater for some of the, of course, areas which they are going to be applied, especially in the human support system for the formation of bones and teeth and other tissues. Now, for the second case, we're going to see that for charge to move in terms of electrical impulses, this is going to be concerning ions, and therefore we shall have this one given as such. So we had mentioned that we can give an example of this specific, of course, pump, which we had said of sodium-potassium ATPase, which of course is going to be a pump involved in trying to, of course, perform this specific function. And of course, we are going to see that this is one of the ways in which these particular elements are going to play a vital role in trying to ensure that there is, of course, there is a conveying of information across various organs and tissues and cells within the body, and that formed a central role of one of the chemical elements in this particular case. Now, we have talked about the concept of catalysis, and this, as we said, is a process which is going to be involved in catalysts, and particularly we talked about the concept of enzymes, which are going to be involved in some of the processes that are going to be requiring this specific catalyst. And these enzymes are going to be working with the collaboration with what we refer to as, of course, what we refer to as a catalyst. And I've mentioned a few enzymes in this particular case, including isomerase, which is going to be involved in isomerism or processes or like the formation of carbon-carbon chains and other processes which are going to be involved. So in a sense, we're going to see that some of the metals which are going to be working, or metal ions which are going to be working with these enzymes are going to facilitate the formation of these specific compounds, and therefore that's going to be one of the roles of these specific, of course, elements. Now, in this case, we mentioned a few examples which are going to be involved in this specific case for the this process of catalysis to be taking place. And I gave a range of ions which include, of course, the zinc, magnesium, and calcium, which are going to be taking place in this particular case. Now, we had also mentioned that apart from playing the role of structural functions, charge carriers, and of course, involving in the process of catalysis, we're going to see that particularly for the last one, this is going to be involved in formation of what we call compounds. So this is going to be involved in formation of these specific compounds, and also it's going to be involved in metabolism of some of the compounds which are going to be, of course, essential in our body. And lastly, it's going to be also involved in degradation of these specific organic compounds. Now, in a sense, we're going to see that these specific three processes are going to be relying on this specific catalyst, which we have said, which are going to be provided for these specific metals. So therefore, that's going to be a very fundamental aspect of this specific process of catalysis, which is going to be involved in some of the elements in order for it to be, of course, successful. So we shall look at a fourth function which we had mentioned, which basically was a conversion of small molecules, which we just mentioned on, conversion of small molecules. Now, in this particular case, we said that basically there are some of the compounds which are going to be involved in biological systems, and of course, which are going to require a large amount of energy. And in this case, we are going to see that for these molecules to be working under the physiological conditions which are in the biosystems, then therefore they are going to be converted in a form which is going to be, of course, efficient for in terms of energy. So, of course, we are going to see that such a kind of a conversion is going to allow for, of course, energetically difficult reactions to be taking place under the physiological conditions which I've mentioned. And this is going to be facilitated by the, of course, the presence of elements which I've mentioned. For instance, we can look at an example of the process like nitrogen fixation, which takes place in the leguminous plants, of course, which is going to involve some of the, of course, catalysts which I've mentioned. And this is going to be facilitated by the presence of metals like iron, molybdenum, and vanadium, which are going to be acting as catalysts, which I've mentioned. So this is going to be one of the roles of these specific elements which are going to be involved in conversion of small molecules, which is one of the major functions which we had listed from our previous videos. Now, perhaps we can just mention those specific functions. And in this specific case, I will just be looking at some of the elements which I've particularly not mentioned for the, of course, non-metallic elements which are going to be assisting us in trying to, of course, understand the same. Now, perhaps lastly but not least, we can mention the concept of electron transfer. Or perhaps we can mention this one in terms of, so let me just give it as electron transfer for energy conversion. So we shall look at two stages of the process of photosynthesis, which is going to be involving one of the, of course, type of a complex that we refer to as, of course, a chlorophyll. And also we shall look at, so this specific process is going to be involving in two particular processes which I have mentioned, of course, of photosynthesis and the cellular respiration. And these two processes are going to be depending on this specific aspect of electron transfer to of course, ensure that there is energy conversion in this particular case. Now, from our discussion on the concept of cell physiology, we said that particularly oxygen is going to be involved in the process of respiration. But in these specific processes, we are going to see that the transfer of electrons is going to be ensuring that there is going to be this is specific aspect of energy conversion taking place. So similarly, we are going to see that for the process of photosynthesis to occur, there's going to be some kind of electron transfer, which is going to be associated with the concept of this specific aspect of energy. So some of the metals which are going to be involved in these ones are going to be metals which we classified as redox-active metals. And we're given different oxidation states, particularly for the metal of iron, which we said iron is going to be involved in this particular case for iron 2 and iron 3. And in a particular case, we had mentioned the concept of iron 4, which is going to be particularly given as such. And of course, we're going also to have these specific oxidation states for copper, which are going to be involved for copper 1, and of course, copper to given as such, which are going to be involved in this specific process of electron transfer for energy conversion, which we can give in terms of an example. So in this particular case, then therefore this is going to be forming a set of the previous discussion, which we had mentioned, particularly for the various functions and roles of metal ions and elements which are going to be involved in biological systems. Now in this case, I will also be looking at a summary of the non-metals which are going to be also involved in particularly the structural and of course the structural and functional integrity of various aspects of biological systems. Now particularly I'm going to be giving these ones in terms of perhaps symbols, but I'm going to elaborate on these various aspects which I'm going to mention. So we're going to see that the elements of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, sulfur are going to be involved in, of course, structural functions of specific, of course, biological systems or molecules. And as we had said, for instance, we can give this one from our previous discussion on the concept of biomolecules. So these are going to be forming essential parts of the structure of biomolecules, which we had given in terms of carbohydrates, lipids. So these are going to be lipids, proteins. You can give in terms of nucleic acids, enzymes. So some of them are basically going to be a classification of the other, like enzymes are going to be a form of proteins. So in this case, we are just going to give them just for elaboration purposes. So we're going to have these biomolecules, which are going to be, of course, having their specific structure being formed by a various range of elements which are listed. For instance, we're going to have the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen forming the carbohydrates, and of course, we're going to have the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, particularly forming these specific compounds of proteins and nucleic acid in this specific case. So this is going to be one of the roles of the non-metals, which we have mentioned in this particular case, being involved in the structural and functional integrity of the various kinds of biological systems. And we're going to come across them in various discussions, especially for various kind of course, biomolecules like this one and this one, which we have already discussed. Now, particularly, we have done an exclusive video on the concept of carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. And I'd also like to request our members to be checking our description boxes on the concept of particularly these specific topics in chemistry, so that you can be at bar with this specific discussion. So in a sense, we are going to see that there's going to be another class which we can mention in this particular case. I've mentioned the concept of carbon, which is going to be forming organic molecules, and I would say that carbon specifically is going to be unique due to its ability to form the carbon-carbon chains through a process of catenation. So in this case, this is one of the processes or advantages, or one of the unique characteristics of carbon, which is going to be assisting of course, formation of various compounds, which are going to be involving, of course, complex compounds, chiral compounds, and of course, we are going to see that's going to be forming chains and rings. And of course, through the ability of carbon to form covalent bonds, and therefore this is going to be resulting in the formation of various bioorganic molecules, which are going to be assisting us in trying to understand this specific importance of the, of course, elements. Now we shall look at another element of hydrogen. Sorry for that. So we shall look at another element of hydrogen, which is essential in maintaining what we refer to as the cell pH. So this is going to be the hydrogen potential, basically referring to the acidity or basicity of the cell contents. And therefore, hydrogen is going to be an essential element involved in trying to maintain the cell or cellular, of course, pH in this particular case. And for some of the structural formation of course, biomolecules like the DNA, this is going to be involved due to the formation of what we refer to as hydrogen bonds. And of course, as I said, we have already talked exhaustively on this specific, of course, aspect of the DNA structure. And this is going to be one of the roles of hydrogen through the formation of hydrogen bonds in trying to stabilize the DNA or the nucleic acid, of course, molecules like this one, and structurally, perhaps for other range of proteins, which we are going to see. So if we look at another element, which is going to be, of course, oxygen. So oxygen basically is going to be forming a structural component of what we refer to as water. And as we said, water is going to be playing a fundamental role in trying to ensure that various functions of the biological systems are going to be working optimally. So in a sense, we're going to see that this is going to be one of the major components of water, which we can give in terms of oxygen. And of course, it's going to be involved in cellular respiration. And this is an important, of course, process which is going to be involving the release of energy, which is essential for cell metabolism. Now, we are also going to be looking at another, of course, element, which is nitrogen. And I said that nitrogen is going to be essential, especially in the formation of this is specific, of course, nucleic acids, particularly for the formation of a nitrogenous base, in, of course, this specific molecule. And of course, we're going to see that nitrogen as well is going to be involved in the formation of what we refer to as, of course, amino acids, which are part of the building blocks, or basically building blocks of proteins, which we're going to see. So this is one of the functions of the element of nitrogen in trying to form a structural part of the nitrogenous base of the nucleic acids, and of course amino acids, which are going to be part of this specific, of course, function of the element of nitrogen. So we shall as well look at the element of phosphorus. And from our structure of the DNA molecules and RNA, we said that this specific element is going to be involved in, of course, forming a phosphate molecule, which is going to be an integral part of the DNA molecules or nucleic acids, which involve the RNA and DNA respectively. So this is going to be as well important for energy transfer, as seen in molecules like adenosine triphosphate, which is going to be an energy, of course, a molecule which is going to be involved in various processes which we are going to come across, or in a way, one way or another, we have mentioned in some of our videos. Now, I've mentioned the concept of sulfur from my opening statement on these specific types of elements for nonmetals. And I said that we can have perhaps a structure of this specific molecule, which we are going to see given as such. So this is going to be a molecule that's going to be an amino acid given in terms of NH. So we shall have this one given as such. So this is going to be sulfur and hydrogen. So basically, this specific molecule is going to be cysteine, which is an amino acid that is going to be formed, of course, among its components is going to be this specific process, of course, element of sulfur, and therefore sulfur is going to be forming a structural aspect of various, of course, amino acids like cysteine, which we are going to come across in some of our discussions, which is going to be an essential part of amino acids and contribute to the structure of various range of proteins, since this is going to be a building block of a set of proteins, and this is going to be achieved through disulfide bonds, which are going to be very relevant for us. Now, perhaps I can mention these specific elements which perhaps are not mentioned under the classification of metals. So we're going to just have an additional information on the concept of magnesium. So magnesium is going to be involved especially in the process of photosynthesis through this green pigment that we call chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll is going to be consisting of a metal center, which is going to be a magnesium bonded with other ligands, which we are going to see in our next video. So this is going to be forming an essential structural part of this specific pigment, and therefore that's going to be assisting us in trying to understand the role of this specific metal in formation of this particular complex, of course, a compound. Now, therefore, it's also going to be involved in some of the enzymes which we are going to see. And of course, I'll just mention the last one, which is going to be iron. Now, in the formation of a hemoglobin, which is an important protein involved in transfer of oxygen around the body. So this is going to be involving of course, the metal of iron, which is going to be an essential part of its structural and functional integrity being given as such. So the elements of sodium, potassium, and chlorine are going to also be maintaining what we refer to as osmotic pressure, and therefore they are also going to be part of the essential elements which we are going to come across, especially in our discussion on various cell physiological processes which are mentioned for the first two which has given us. So in this case, this is going to be also involved in the controlling of osmotic potential and the electrical stability of the cell membrane in cell physiology. So I'd like to encourage our members to be checking our description boxes for various links of other videos. Engage us in the comment section, ring that notification bell, and kindly subscribe so that we can form a large group of members discussing these specific topics. So that is it for now, guys. Bye, God bless you. Catch us in our next video.